Welcome to the HR on the Offensive podcast, a weekly podcast by Lace Partners, a fundamentally different HR and payroll consultancy. Each week, we tackle some of the most interesting topics facing senior HR professionals. So whether that's from employee value proposition, performance management, people strategy, or even payroll, we cover it all. So join us for the next 30 minutes. And if you like what you hear, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Now, on with the show. On today's episode of the HR on the Offensive podcast, I was joined by Aaron and Sally Earnshaw, who is lovingly called the Chief Oomph Officer of the business that she runs. And Aaron, myself and Sally had a really, really interesting chat around our new campaign called Driving Business Transformation. And it's the role that HR plays in leading the people element of business-wide transformation. What are the barriers? What are some of the challenges that HR professionals face? What's the impact of culture as well? So it was a really, really good chat. We talked about some important elements that HR professionals, chief people officers need to think about when it comes to that business transformation and also managing change, whether it's from the C-suite or throughout the business. So really, really interesting chat. Hope you enjoy it, but on with the show. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to the latest HR on the Offensive podcast. It's me, Chris Howard from Lace Partners. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Today's podcast is going to be a little bit campaign themed. We have recently launched a campaign called Driving Business Transformation, and it's all around the role that HR or the people function plays in enabling the people side of business-wide transformation. We've got a whole bunch of activities that we are doing around events on different elements of this campaign. How does HR get involved, or how does the CPO get involved in the decision and design making process of a business-wide transformation? How do you prepare the HR function, but also the business for business-wide transformation, digitally or otherwise? What we wanted to do today is get an external perspective, because what you're going to get from us over the coming weeks and months is a Lace perspective on some of the different component parts of the campaign. But we wanted to get an external perspective as well, because it's always nice to hear other people's opinions on these sort of things. I have a co-host, as always. It is our founder, Aaron Aubrey. Aaron, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing very well, Chris. Good to see you.
Good to see you too, and good to get into the detail of this. This is the first podcast that we've done on this campaign, so I'm quite excited to explore a little bit of the thoughts of our guest today. It's a lady called Sally Earnshaw. She is described as Chief Oompher for an organisation called Oomph. Sally, how are you?
I'm very well. Thank you, Chris. Very well indeed.
We're going to have to get into the chief a bit. So perhaps before we do our fundamentally different question, and if this is the first time you are listening to this podcast, what we do is every single episode, we will do a fundamentally different question that is completely not related to HR, because it's a little bit of fun, but we're going to get to that in a minute. First and foremost, though, Sally, talk to me about your role as Chief Oompher and give our guests a little bit of the background, and then Aaron and I will quiz you on some driving business transformation thoughts.
Perfect. Well, if I were to describe in one sentence what I do, it's to help organisations accelerate their performance through people. I sit in the lane that is the people lane. I suppose if you were to do the technical term for us, it would be about bringing the oomph into organisations as they try to navigate this hugely challenging landscape that everybody finds themselves in. I started my first 10 years of my career in financial services, actually. And then when I left financial services, I worked in a number of different organisations and suddenly realised how vastly different companies were. It was a bit of a shock to me because the first company I worked for was awesome. And I thought all companies were like that. And then I discovered, sadly, there's a bell curve and you've got both ends of the spectrum. I got very curious about culture and how to change it. I've spent 22 years helping companies shift culture. And it'll be no surprise for you to hear that in the last 5 or 6 years, that's been mostly around shifting culture against a backdrop of massive change. So change leadership is really now what I spend most of my time helping companies to do. So hopefully that weaves in the credibility.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And of course, culture is a key part of what we're talking about with regards to how you drive business-wide transformation. Aaron, we're going to fire across a few questions to Sally in a bit, but we have to do the fundamentally different question. I'm going to start with Sally. So I'm going to let you, just because you're the founder of Lace, and you'll tell me off afterwards if I haven't given you enough time. So fundamentally different question for today. I've seen a video this week, and it is about a club, an Austrian cinema has created a club. They call it Knits and Flicks. Now, Knits is Knits. They invite patrons to come along with their knitting. They watch a movie and do some knitting because apparently it's quite good for mindfulness and therapeutic. And I saw that and I thought, that's really interesting. I'm going to ask Sally and Aaron if they could take anything into a cinema, what would it be? I started to think about this myself. I've been getting into Lego, but the problem with Lego is I'd spend all of my time focusing on the Lego. And when people said, how was the movie? I'd have absolutely no idea. So I fall down straight away with my initial thought. But Sally, what would you take into a cinema and why?
Oh, so I found this question really easy to answer, actually. I would want to take my dogs because one of the main reasons I don't get to go to the cinema anymore is because to go to the cinema, obviously, you're not allowed to take dogs in. It might be very irritating to people who don't like dogs. So you don't get to go because that would mean leaving them at home for maybe 3 or 4 hours. So I rarely go, and now I just watch Netflix. I'd really like to go to the movies. If I could take my dogs, I would go way more often. And I think maybe there is a cinema somewhere that allows dogs, but not in Portsmouth.
I love that. So it's not Knits and Flicks, it's Pups and Flicks or something like that. Aaron, what
it's really interesting because our listeners won't believe me, but I wrote dogs cinemas because I also have just got a new dog. And so dealing with all of this reality, Sally, of suddenly realizing I can't go to the places I thought I used to go to. But I think I would create a soundproof box that the dog could breathe, but the sound wouldn't come out. That way they can woof away as much as they want, either my dog or somebody else's dog, and it would all be cool. So we could still watch the movie. I still think there's a fundamental challenge with your one, Chris, around Lego, which is it's dark in a cinema. You're either going to build the wrong thing or you're going to stand on a Lego brick and yelp in the middle of the cinema.
We're going to give that to both of you, and it certainly beats my Lego idea. So let's talk about our campaign a little bit. Aaron, perhaps a bit of a framing exercise from you. I talked about it a little bit, but why we decided to get Sally on to talk a little bit around leaders effectively communicating the why behind business transformation. But perhaps before we do that, do you want to frame your thoughts around the campaign and why we decided to bring Sally in today?
I'll keep it brief, but and try and keep it as simple as possible, Chris. I think for a long time, we have been working with CPOs, and they are involved more and more in driving, enabling, and executing on business transformation. Anyone in business right now knows that business transformation is not a one and done thing. It is a continual change environment. Ever since COVID, that has accelerated. And therefore, the demands on the people function have never been higher to be at that table and engaged. And I think the more over the years, research has continued to reinforce that the people element of that is critical to the success of the programs of transformation. Therefore, HR has a very strong role to play in that. We talk in this campaign about lots of different dimensions, capability and capacity in HR to be able to do it, the mindset of the business, and the mindset of HR to engage at the right way in terms of business transformation. But we also talk about some of the big dimensions around what makes a successful people stream in a business transformation, and leadership and culture are right at the heart of that conversation, and how important it is to galvanize leadership around making that happen. And that's why it's great to be here with Sally, because this is what you do, right, Sally?
Totally is. And I've already written down 2 things that you've said that definitely play to what I always talk about as well. So
well, go for it then.
No, I was just going to jump in on you said demands on the CPO have never been greater. One of the phrases I say all the time is, in today's economy, in today's climate, demands on leaders have never been greater. Every time I enter into a conversation with a company, that is the big challenge. Demands on leaders have never been greater. So what do? There's a stretch on capacity, there's a stretch on skill, there are different kinds of leadership required. Everybody is challenged, everybody is stretched, and nobody has actually a Scooby about what the future is going to look like in reality. There's a massive amount of uncertainty and ambiguity that everyone's trying to navigate. Depends on your lens, doesn't it? What a challenge ahead of us, or what a nightmare we're all in. I'm the former, just for the record.
Yeah, certainly. Let's go to that first question then, because we were talking, when we originally were discussing this between the three of us about running the podcast, we talked about the importance of leaders and their ability to communicate the why behind a business transformation. Let's take that CPO, that CHRO lens. How do they effectively put themselves in that position where they are able to articulate the why, not just on a HR group-wide transformation, but a business transformation. Just some thoughts on that, if that's all right, Sally.
Before we get to the how, though, we kind of talk about transformation all the time. And I had given this question a bit of thought before, because I suppose you've got to ask yourself the question, why is the why even important in the first place? And I think for decades, even longer, organizations have been pretty good at the what. I think strategy is a thing. I think people know how to create one. I think there's 1,000 million tools online for you to be really good at strategy. And I think that historically there was a sort of a 3 or 5 year outlook, and businesses had their mechanisms and processes around that, and away you went. And obviously the world is very different now. I don't need to underline that for anybody listening, but the world is different, given that the pace of change and transformation is constant. It's not just a one-time thing. It's this constantly evolving strategic pivot, sometimes just to tilt. The demands on leaders is greater, but also the need to bring people with you at pace has massively increased. Therefore, what I see in the line of work that I do is some real strength around the what. If you go into any company, there's usually the strategy deck. There'll be the slides that they use to articulate where they're going. Many of the companies will have shareholders that they have to convince of the what. So we're not bad at what, but we're really terrible at why. You've got to persuade leaders initially that the why is important for your HR community. I think there are a lot of business leaders who are very comfortable with the what and are really good at sharing the 73-page slide deck to whomever will listen. But there maybe isn't that either understanding or muscle in being able to create the why. Why is the why important? Because if you want to bring people with you, they need to understand the compelling case for this. Like, why are we going there and why should I care fundamentally? And so that whole thing around, before you even get to the how do people do it, sometimes it's about persuading people that the why is even important in the first place, because we're not short on what. So the why is important. If you want to compel people to come with you, you've got to be really good at explaining why. Therefore, we have to be able to provide construct around that, making it really easy for people to articulate the why in their organization. One of the very simple things that I teach organizations is around a 3-chapter construct for being able to create a compelling case for the journey that we're about to go on. And it's so easy. It's a why, what, how construct. It's like, why are we going there? What are we shooting for? And how are we going to get there? That the why is articulated through 2 things: our context, what's the landscape that we're in that provides the reason why where we're going makes sense. For some, that's a burning platform. For others, it's a seize the day, depends on your environment. But it's what is our context that provides the platform. And the second part of the why is, where are we today? What is our current reality that provides confidence that we can achieve what we're about to articulate? It's like, what's our context? Burning platform, run fast, or seize the day opportunity. But our current picture, how do we describe where we are today that provides a super compelling reason why? I always use the phrase, we are perfectly poised for this next phase based on exactly these reasons. A funny story, if I asked leaders to write down how they would describe their current reality in a room with nobody looking, 90% of what they write down will be negative. And so when you're building the why for change, I often have to help them shift the lens they're looking through, because most top leaders will look at their business and present all the reasons that things need to be fixed. So it's, how do we provide that real confidence given our current reality to really delve into the next chapter? So that was a really long answer, and I think Aaron probably wants to jump in.
No, I love it, Sally. It's really cool. That point about why is so important. One of the things we talk about quite often with CPOs and around it just transforming their own functions, for example, let alone business transformation, is the importance of the why through the lens of, I think you mentioned it there, why should I care, right? But the what's in it for me, then what makes it important to that group of people. And I guess once you've got your main why of why we're doing this, you have to then take that position. And I think that's sometimes where the CPO can really start to play into some of this discussion. It starts really getting into the people function, really understanding the workforces, what's going to make a difference.
And I've seen people get a little bit stuck in the articulating. You've probably seen this as well. People say, we need to be really clear on the what's in it for me, the why should I care? And my answer to that is always, you need to really get your leadership able to talk to the different types of why should I care. Yes. It's different for everybody. What drives the top team is rarely what drives most people in the organization. You've got to be a rare beast to want to lead a corporate giant. For most people, it's about understanding what drives them. And that requires flexibility, people reading skills, knowing my people and taking the time to articulate it. It's a skill set in its own right, being able to articulate the what's in it for me. It's not a one size fits all. I completely agree.
And you use the word, I think, compel, how we compel people to come with. And I think it's that compelled to come with rather than compelled to do. And I sometimes think that gets lost in this whole mix, right, around the why at the start of a program.
I have a phrase, you'll love it. My experience tells me a lot of organizations struggle with what I call the ask for task. Whenever we communicate anything, it just feels like an ask for task. And you get the proverbial eye roll out of any frontline teams when it just feels like you're asking me to do more. Do you know what I mean? It's
Yes.
like Simon Sinek, who I love. Many of your HR community will probably have heard of him, if not also love him. He has got a brilliant phrase in his Start With the Why book, as we're talking about the why. And he says, great leaders give people something to believe in and not just something to do. And I think that's the shift, isn't it? It's like, how do we give them something to believe in, to be part of? And that requires us to lift our eyes up from day job, and everyone's busy, heads down, next week, next month, I get it. But we've got to lift up and go, where are we going? What is there to believe in here?
And I think that's why Cecil burning platform is a great way to describe it, right? It galvanizes purpose. We're either going to go for something or we're going to protect ourselves against something. And it's those two things really sort of play. I think brings us to another question we wanted to talk through. When you're working with an organization and you've got that context laid out, you start taking a view of how good they are going to be at this. And most organizations, this is a muscle they have to either rebuild or they have to hone or build from scratch, right? Building a culture of change in an organization, a mindset around change, a sort of muscle around it. Where do you start?
The first thing I'll say on that is, in response to you saying this isn't a muscle necessarily that everybody has flexed enough, I think I'm always very careful of not being a typical consultant that goes into organizations and says, everybody's rubbish at this and I want to teach you the world and I'm going to be I have a view that actually most human beings, we're all brilliant storytellers, tell stories down the pub, we tell stories to our mates. But it's really odd that when you come into big corporate environments, all of a sudden we start communicating in a really weird way, PowerPoints and bullets and facts, and it all gets very serious. But we're all natural communicators. My view is that there's a muscle that leaders don't necessarily flex enough, even though we're very natural at doing it. If we just lift the lid off a little bit with leaders, they're actually really good at it. What they often just need is a bit of a show me how. What does good look like? But also, I have a phrase, even the least charismatic of leaders can be really compelling if they just show up as themselves, be authentic, be passionate. I've got loads of little toolkits around how to do that. It's like anybody can do this. It's not like gift of the gab person's amazing at it. Quite often the finance leaders are the ones that go, it's not really my thing. And you're like, no, it's everybody's thing because we're just people. We're amazing. Just learn how to free yourself a bit.
So this is really interesting. I am very interested to explore this and this whole idea of storytelling and people, I can't really do that. Oh, I'm a finance person. I'm not really into that. And I loved the example you gave about, you tell stories in the pub. So what's the difference there? It's almost a bit like, you see some of those adverts. There's an advert at the moment involving Colin Montgomery, the golfer. It's for an insurance brand. It's the most wooden advert. He's on the golf course talking to his mates, but it doesn't sound like he's talking to his mates. It sounds like somebody's written a script for him. You see those adverts, and quite often people in advertisements, you often think people in real life don't talk like that. And if we flip that into this instance, people don't always talk in that sort of business sense in real life. So bring the story into real life, be authentic. And I guess my question that I then wanted to lead into that is around, and maybe you started to talk about this, Sally, but it's around leaders, how they need to adapt, or what are the skills that they need to deliver for the future of work. So I'd love to just get some thoughts around that, because I feel like we're just scratching the surface there around you need to be authentic, bring your sort of whole self, be the real person type stuff. But just some thoughts on that.
You're amazing at landing massive questions. Wow.
We do enjoy it.
Oh my gosh, future of work. By the way, I'm a people expert. People have been around forever. I'm not an AI expert. I'm as terrified about the future as thing. What I'm seeing from a leadership perspective is there's a load of work, you've probably seen it, around bold leadership. In the new economy, you have to be a little bit bolder. And that bold leadership, I've sort of packaged up into three things. Number one, being able to see possibility, because there's so much of it. The future of work is massive possibility, and none of us can even paint a picture of it. How do you even navigate this massive shift? Being able to see possibility, being able to execute, to have the resilience and focus to know what to run at and keep yourself resilient while you're doing that. But the third one is be able to bring people with you. The best ideas in the world go nowhere if we can't bring people on the journey with us. In the future of work, leaders are going to need to massively increase their ability to bring people with them, to compel change, to get people to want to come, because we're going to be going in all sorts of different directions. So that whole, how do leaders need to adapt? They need to get brilliant at bringing people with them and therefore communicating, which we've spoken about. And they also need to get brilliant at leading the people, because loads of the stuff in today's economy is all about how do leaders get better at knowing what AI is going to do. And I kind of go, that may well be true. But what I also see is this thing called the tangibility bias. There was a study by Korn Ferry, you might have seen it, years ago, and they studied 800 global CEOs, and they discovered this tangibility bias, a propensity to run towards things that are binary, that you can plug and play, technology being number one, and less of a propensity to focus on things that are less binary, more complex, humans. And yet in the services sector, the value of human capital is 3 times that of technology, believe it or not. So you kind of go, if we have a bias towards the technology, the black and white, the tangible, and less of a bias for focusing on the people, the value will come from the people. In my humble opinion, where it's at really is bringing our people with us as we navigate this technology-infused digital landscape. It's going to be about how we get people to use the technology, how we get people to be wrapping their skills around technology. The focus is in the wrong place. It's like everyone's running the technical stuff. The answer is through people, which is why the HR community suddenly become, I think, the most important people in organizations, because who's going to help with that? You'd hope the HR community. So yeah, they got to be bold. You've got to bring people with you. People are going to be important. And there's a bias towards not that, because people are complex.
I agree completely. And I think this driving business transformation campaign that we're leading with at this point is very much focused on exactly that point, which is to complete business transformation and sustain it. Yeah. Once you've got to sustain it, you've got to bring people with you. And the success is determined by how many of those people come with you and buy into it and adapt to new ways of working, which is why it's so important, I think, for CPOs to be at the table from the start, for their functions to be prepared to support that. Or if they're not built to do that, a lot of people, their HR functions aren't built to do continual business change. That wasn't what they were designed for. It's to recognize that this skill set and capability needs to be built in the business or brought into the business in some way to help it work. I think it's great to hear you talk about that. I think we talk about leading through change. One of those big things you have to start a business transformation program with. Great places to work. If you ever had a chance to look through their research, there's some amazing stats that talk about if you can create that environment for change in your organization, you will outperform your competitors. It's enough data collected over the last 10 years, 15 years show that the success of a business transformation is significantly improved if you can get the people aspect right. So I think it's why it's so important to get this positioning done.
I completely agree. And it goes back to the question that you asked me earlier, which is how do you get a business change ready? And so we've sort of answered the question around be compelling at the start. So where do you start with change leadership? Be really clear about where you're going, but also get the compelling story right. Underneath that, though, which is the second thing that organizations need to get really good at doing, in my experience, people, leaders, all the way through the organization are quite terrified of this. It's being able to manage people's reaction to change and help them get through their understanding, clarity, kind of, jump in feet first and wade around in some of the responses that you get when you first articulate change. And one of the single biggest thing that resonates when I talk about change in organizations is understanding people rather than things. If we understand even a tiny bit about the psychology of human beings, like a small amount, you don't need to be an expert, a tiny bit of psychology will tell you that when there's change and uncertainty, the human brain doesn't like change and uncertainty. So it starts to distort our thinking. It's called distorted thinking patterns. But it does weird things like filter out information or distort things. There are 3, and there's many weird things about the human brain, but the 3 most common in change are a propensity to focus on the negatives, which is obviously going to be very helpful if we're leaning into change, like a propensity to focus on the negatives, not the positives, a propensity to put things in boxes, black and white thinking. So it will work, it won't work. Well, we all know that it'll be somewhere in the middle. It's like there's this, we love putting things in boxes in today's economy. Social media amplifies that. And the third is catastrophizing. And actually, I work with a load of risk leaders and they'll say, but you have to know, all eventuality. And I say, I completely agree. But it's when we're using catastrophizing in our language, they never do that. We always, and it's like catastrophic language paints a picture and a model that isn't actually accurate for where we're at. Yeah. So knowing that distortions exist, most leaders go, I always say, do you see these thinking patterns in the workplace? And people go, I see them at home. Like, yeah, we're just people. So once you know that exists, you can then do something about it. And so my second skill that I teach, if the first skill is how to be compelling, the second skill is how to reframe some of that thinking. Leaders as facilitators, leaders as people who can, when somebody says, here are the 10 reasons why that won't work, that we know what to say. And what we don't do is we don't say, you're wrong, because now we're in an argument and people just dig in. What we have to do is get really good at acknowledging, totally get it. Of course you'd think that, but how to facilitate them to see it differently. Leading as facilitating is one of the biggest skills that I'm asked to teach.
Just going to reflect on business transformation and the role of HR in all of this, right? Because what you've described there is sometimes what we describe and talk with some of our listeners were around sort of what you need to build in your leadership team inside your HR function in terms of talent management and change capability. But quite often we see that occurring outside of HR in organizations, or HR being too late to the table to some of those conversations, and the business charging on with this change without thinking through everything we've just sort of talked through, right? And I guess if there's any thoughts in our last question that you'd leave people with, if they're a CPO coming in to transform an organization and then inheriting an organization that's not done it before, what would be the couple of things that you would say just get a handle on first? What would be the things?
Maybe this isn't the exact answer to that question, but you just reminded me when you're talking about the CPO and the HR community, who are quite often dealing with their own distorted thinking if they are part of the change. I've been there so many times. I've done a few big conferences with HR leaders where not only do they have to be managing the transformation and leading others, but they're quite often in it themselves. Mm-hmm. And to do what we call oxygen mask leadership, which is, you've got to put your big boy or girl pants on, like oxygen mask on, and lead the charge. So resilience in that community is very helpful. But I mean, it's a big question to say, what do you get a grip on first? If we're talking about leading change, I would say, what is the single quickest route to leading change through in an organization? And so the single quickest route is, it goes back to the quote, when you ask an audience of people, who wants change? And everybody puts a hand up, and you say, who wants to change? And then it's a slightly lesser ripple of response. The single quickest route to getting change in an organization is leaders who role model. If the HR community can nudge, encourage, provoke, poke the top team to, if we're asking our people to behave differently, the single quickest route is to have leaders who role model that change 10 times amplified from what we're expecting from our people. Most top teams will say we need them to change. And my first question is, how will we demonstrate visible change at the top so that they can see us role modeling that behavior? Call it symbolic actions. If you've only got one thing you can do as a CPO, that's probably what I'd do.
I really love that. It's almost the CPO being the voice. It's the holding up the mirror. It's the, guys, we're all sat around the table here, so I'm going to hold the mirror up and say, are we ready? I really love that. Who wants change versus who wants to change, but also the oxygen mask leadership. What a great way to round us off on today's podcast. Sally, it's been absolutely amazing spending some time with you today. Thank you very much for getting your view on the world and all things business transformation and change and culture. It's been fascinating for me personally, so thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I could have gone on for hours. So
I know it feels like this should be a 3-part series or something. Aaron,
I would love to have stayed on. I was really enjoying it. Thank you, Sally. Really helpful. Thank you.
No, it's been absolutely brilliant. Hopefully you've enjoyed this podcast. If you want to find out a little bit more about the campaign, go onto Lace Partners website. There's a little tab at the top of our menu screen which says campaigns, and you'll see driving business transformation. There's a little bit more information on there. We'll be putting this podcast up. From myself, Sally and Aaron, thank you very much for listening in, and hopefully we'll catch you next time on the HR on the Offensive podcast. Bye-bye.